The first thing I saw that morning was a bright red envelope sitting between my coffee mug and my mail pile, and I remember thinking, well, that's never a good sign. I opened it expecting maybe a neighborhood announcement or some reminder about trash pickup, but instead I found a violation notice from my HOA telling me I owed them $820 because I was supposedly running an unauthorized business from my home. The funny part? The business they were talking about was me sitting at my desk, wearing an old sweatshirt, drinking coffee, and doing my regular 9-to-5 job on a company laptop. I wish I could say I laughed immediately, but honestly, I just sat there for a minute staring at that paper because I couldn't understand how someone could look at a quiet home office and somehow turn it into a neighborhood crime scene. I live in a small community called Willow Creek Estates, a place with neat sidewalks, trimmed lawns, and the kind of neighbors who wave at you while secretly checking if your trash can is 3 inches too close to the curb. It's a nice place. Don't get me wrong. My wife and I chose this neighborhood because it felt peaceful. The houses were attractive, the streets were quiet, and after years of working hard, we wanted a place where we could finally settle down. My office was upstairs in a spare bedroom overlooking the backyard. Nothing fancy, just a wooden desk, a chair that had seen better days, a laptop provided by my employer, and a small coffee maker that honestly probably worked harder than I did some mornings. I wasn't running a company. I wasn't selling products. I wasn't meeting clients. Nobody was coming and going from my house. For 3 years, I followed the same routine. Wake up, make coffee, walk upstairs, open my laptop, and work for a company based in another state. That was it. Quiet, simple, boring even. And somehow, according to the HOA, that had become a problem. When I called their office, I expected someone to explain there had been a mistake. Instead, I got transferred to the community manager, a woman named Diane Keller who had a very specific tone of voice, the kind where you could tell she had already decided she was right before the conversation even started. She said, "Several residents have reported increased business activity coming from your property." I remember looking around my office because I genuinely wondered if I had missed something. "Business activity?" I asked. "What exactly are they talking about?" She told me neighbors had noticed lights on during work hours, frequent deliveries, and what they described as ongoing professional activity. I had to pause because I almost laughed. "Diane, the deliveries are groceries. The lights are on because I'm working, and the professional activity is me doing my job." She didn't laugh. Not even a little. She explained that the HOA rules prohibited home businesses that created traffic, disturbances, or commercial activity. So I grabbed my copy of the rules and read the section she mentioned. Once, twice, 3 times. And the strange thing was, the rule didn't say anything about remote employees. It talked about businesses that brought customers into the neighborhood, businesses that created noise, parking issues, or constant visitors. It never mentioned someone sitting alone at a desk working for a company somewhere else. I pointed that out, but Diane simply said, "The board has interpreted the rule differently." That sentence stayed with me because I've learned over the years that when someone says they are interpreting a rule, sometimes what they really mean is they are stretching it until it fits what they want. 2 weeks later, instead of dropping the issue, the HOA added late fees and demanded documentation proving I was not operating a commercial business. That's when I stopped seeing it as a simple misunderstanding. Something about the way they handled it bothered me. It wasn't just the money. It was the assumption that they could accuse me first and make me prove myself afterward. So I did something I don't normally like doing. I called an attorney. His name was Marcus Reed, and the first thing he did when I explained the situation was smile. Not a big dramatic smile, just a calm little smile that made me feel like he had already seen this kind of thing before. He said, "Send me everything they gave you, every notice, every rule, every email. If they are enforcing something, we need to know exactly how they are enforcing it." At the time, I thought we were just trying to clear up an $820 mistake. I had no idea that request for records was about to uncover something that would completely change the entire fight. When Marcus came back with the records, I could tell from the look on his face that this was no longer just about my $820 fine. He had that same calm expression he always had, but there was something different this time. He placed a thick folder on my kitchen table, opened it slowly, and said, "I think you are going to find this interesting." I remember leaning forward because, honestly, I was expecting some boring paperwork issue. Maybe a mistake in the HOA database. Maybe someone misunderstood the rule. What I found instead was something that completely changed the way I looked at the entire situation. Marcus had requested every enforcement action related to home businesses, every violation notice, every board discussion, and every record where the HOA had decided someone was operating a commercial activity from their home. And sitting right there in those documents was a pattern. The HOA wasn't enforcing the rule the way they claimed they were. They were enforcing it only when they wanted to. Marcus pointed to 3 different names on the list. "Do you recognize these people?" he asked. I did. One was Patricia Monroe, a board member who lived 2 streets away from me. Another was Kevin Lawson, who was always talking at community meetings about maintaining standards. The third was someone who rarely spoke but had been on the board for years. Marcus said, "All 3 of them have some form of home-based work." At first, I thought maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe their situations were different. So I looked closer. Patricia Monroe was running a private consulting service from her dining room. Kevin Lawson was selling handmade furniture online through a small business he operated from his garage. Another board member had a side business managing digital services for clients. The difference was, nobody had sent them violation letters. Nobody had charged them hundreds of dollars. Nobody had demanded proof that they weren't breaking the rules. I just sat there staring at those pages because suddenly the whole thing made sense. This wasn't really about noise. It wasn't about traffic. It wasn't about protecting the neighborhood. It was about who they believed should have permission and who they believed should ask for it. I told Marcus, "So they aren't against people working from home. They're against me working from home." He nodded and said, "Exactly. This is called selective enforcement. And judges tend to take that very seriously." That phrase stayed in my mind. Selective enforcement. It sounded simple, but it explained everything. The rule wasn't the problem. The way they used it was. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. I started noticing little things I hadn't noticed before. Conversations would stop when I walked by. People who used to wave suddenly became very interested in their phones. It felt strange because I had lived there for years without any issues. I wasn't the loud neighbor. I wasn't the person with the messy yard or the broken fence. I was the guy who kept to himself, paid his dues, and followed the rules. But now, somehow, I had become the example they wanted everyone else to learn from. The HOA president, Linda Carver, eventually sent another message saying the board was standing by its decision and that they were protecting community integrity. That phrase bothered me more than the fine itself, because when people use words like integrity, they often make it sound like they are defending something bigger than themselves. But sometimes, behind those words, there is just someone trying to maintain control. Marcus prepared everything for the hearing. He didn't want to make it emotional. He told me, "We are not going in there angry. We are going in there prepared." And that was exactly what happened. The hearing was held in a small community meeting room. Nothing dramatic. No giant courtroom. Just folding chairs, a long table, and the HOA board sitting behind stacks of papers like they were preparing for some kind of battle. Linda sat in the middle, confident as ever. She had a folder in front of her and kept adjusting her glasses while looking through my file. When she spoke, she used the same polished language HOA boards always use. "Our goal is simply to maintain the standards that make this community desirable." I looked around the room and wondered how many times that sentence had been used to justify something unfair. Marcus waited patiently. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He let her finish. Then he opened his folder and placed the first document on the table. "Then perhaps we should begin by applying those standards equally." The room got quiet. Linda looked up. Marcus handed the board copies of the records, showing their own members had similar home activities. Nobody said anything. The confidence in the room started to shift. Linda tried to explain that those situations were different. Marcus calmly asked, "Different how?" She didn't have a clear answer. Then he placed my employment contract on the table. He explained that I was a remote employee for a company based in another state. I didn't have customers coming to my house. I didn't operate a storefront. I didn't advertise locally. I didn't create traffic. I simply performed my job from a room inside my home. Then Marcus placed one more document in front of everyone. It was the city ordinance regarding remote employment. The wording was clear. Remote work without client interaction or customer visits did not qualify as operating a home business. For the first time since this whole thing started, nobody from the HOA had anything to say. Linda looked down at the papers. The board members looked at each other. And I remember sitting there thinking about how strange the whole situation was. Months earlier, they had been so certain they were right. They had sent letters, added fees, and treated me like I was breaking some serious community rule. But now, sitting in that room, their own paperwork was telling a completely different story. The final decision was left to the hearing officer, and as he reviewed the documents, the room became completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Everyone was waiting for the same answer. And when he finally looked up, I knew the next few words were going to determine whether the HOA's entire argument survived or collapsed right in front of everyone. The hearing officer looked through the documents one last time, and I remember watching his eyes move across the pages because, at that moment, everyone in that room was waiting for the same thing. The HOA board was sitting there with the same confidence they had carried from the very beginning. But something had changed. A few hours earlier, they walked in believing they were the ones holding all the power. They had the violation notice, the fees, the rules, and the authority of the association behind them. But now, sitting across that table, they had something much harder to fight against: facts. The hearing officer placed the papers down, took a slow breath, and looked over at Linda Carver. Then he said, "The evidence does not support the claim that this homeowner was operating an unauthorized business. Working remotely for an employer is not the same as running a commercial operation from a residence." The room went completely silent. It wasn't the dramatic kind of silence you see in movies where someone drops a shocking piece of information and everyone gasps. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of silence where people realize the answer they were hoping to avoid has already arrived. He continued, explaining that the violation had to be removed, the fines dismissed, and the HOA's records corrected. The $820 charge that had started this entire mess was officially gone. I looked over at Marcus, my attorney, and he simply closed his folder and gave me a small nod. No celebration, no victory speech, no dramatic handshake, just a quiet moment where both of us understood that the truth had finally caught up with the story they had been trying to tell. And honestly, I thought I would feel happier than I did. I thought I would feel like I had won some huge battle. But sitting there, I mostly felt relieved, because the strange thing about situations like this is that you don't wake up wanting to fight. Nobody enjoys spending weeks gathering documents, reading regulations, and wondering if someone with a little authority is going to make your life harder. I didn't want a war with my HOA. I wanted to drink my coffee in the morning, do my job, mow my lawn, and live quietly. That was the whole reason we moved there in the first place. But somewhere along the way, a simple misunderstanding became a test of whether rules were meant to protect people or control them. A few days after the hearing, I received an official letter from the HOA confirming the violation had been removed. They also returned my $820 along with the late fees they had added while the dispute was ongoing. But the story didn't end there. The board had to address the situation publicly because other homeowners had started asking questions. At the next community meeting, which I attended from the back of the room, Linda stood at the front and read a prepared statement about clarifying remote employment policies. It was a very carefully written statement, the kind where every word sounds professional but nobody actually says, "We were wrong." And I understood why. Admitting mistakes is difficult, especially when those mistakes come from people who are used to making decisions for everyone else. But the important part was that the rule had changed. The message had been sent. People in the neighborhood now knew that working from home was not automatically a violation. What surprised me most was how many neighbors approached me afterward. Some of them had never said anything during the entire dispute. They had watched from a distance. They had seen the notices, heard the rumors, and stayed quiet. But after the decision, several people came up and told me they were glad someone challenged the board. One neighbor named Tom, a retired engineer who lived across the street, shook my hand and said, "I have worked from my house for years. I just never told anyone because I didn't want the headache." That sentence stuck with me because it showed me the real impact of what happened. The problem wasn't just one unfair fine. The problem was that people had started changing their behavior because they were afraid of being targeted. A community cannot function that way. Rules should create trust, not fear. Over the next few months, the HOA went through some uncomfortable changes. Their attorney recommended reviewing enforcement procedures because the records showed inconsistencies. The association spent about $3,000 in legal fees defending a decision that could have been resolved with one honest conversation at the beginning. 2 board members resigned before the next election. They didn't make a public statement. They didn't apologize. They simply stepped away. And maybe that was the closest thing to an admission that anyone was going to get. Life eventually returned to normal. I went back to my routine. Every morning, I walked upstairs to my little office, opened my laptop, and started work. The same desk was there. The same window overlooking the backyard was there. The only thing that changed was how I saw that room. Before all this happened, it was just where I worked. Afterward, it became a reminder that sometimes ordinary people have to stand up when something feels wrong. Not because they want attention, not because they want conflict, but because if nobody questions unfair decisions, those decisions become normal. Looking back, I don't consider myself someone who defeated the HOA. That isn't really how I see it. I think the rules won. The actual rules. The ones that were written down. The ones that were supposed to apply equally to everyone. What failed was the assumption that power alone was enough. And maybe that's the lesson I took from the whole experience. Most people are willing to follow rules. They just want those rules to be fair. They want the same standards applied to everyone, not just the people who are easiest to pressure. I still live in Willow Creek Estates. I still say hello to my neighbors. I still attend community meetings occasionally. And yes, I still work from the same upstairs office where this entire thing started. But now, whenever someone asks me about what happened, I tell them the same thing. I didn't fight because I hated the HOA. I fought because I believed they should follow the same rules they expected everyone else to follow. And that's why I want to hear your opinion. Do you think the HOA was simply trying to enforce community standards? Or do you think they crossed the line by using a rule that didn't actually apply? If you have ever lived in a place where a small group of people had the power to make decisions for everyone else, I want to know your experience. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my situation. Would you have paid the fine just to avoid the stress? Or would you have taken the fight all the way? Because sometimes the biggest conflicts don't start with huge problems. Sometimes they start with a single letter in your mailbox and a decision about whether you are willing to stand up and open it.